So in this video, we're going to start by looking at GDP, and it's actually in two parts. So if we take a look, there's the first part about regular kind of just old GDP and how we calculate it, and the second is how we adjust GDP for price levels and for a couple of other things. So we're going to do both of those in this one video. So the first thing on here says draw the basic circular flow model. And in large part, we include that here because it's a good way of thinking about GDP. So in thinking about the circular flow, you have households and you have firms, right? Those are kind of the two basic actors in a market economy. And then you have a factor market right down here. And up here you have a product market. Now, a factor market is where we buy and sell the factors of production, so land, labor, and capital. And the product market is where we buy and sell products like goods and services. So we're going to think about the circular flow as money in the economy. And money is going to, I'm going to switch colors here to green because it's money. Money is going to go from firms to the factor market, and it's going to be used in that factor market to pay workers. And what do those workers do with their money? Well, they send it over to the product market where they buy goods and services from the firms. And so in our most simple model of the circular flow, we kind of established that there's this symbiotic relationship between households and firms, and that if we were to say pause the money flow and then just count up the money flow at one point, right, and say all the spending in the economy. Or if we were to say pause up all the money flow here and say this is all the income that households earn, then those are kind of simple ways of figuring out how much economic activity is taking place. So the two approaches to calculating gross domestic product, which is to say how much economic activity is going on, is as a shorthand, is we can stop kind of the flow and count up all the dollars that are spent here, or we can count up all the dollars as income. So now we're going to switch gears and type a little bit into the problem set and get a formal definition, really, of GDP. And GDP is the final dollar value, and let me be clear here, the dollar value, or we could use other currencies. So you could do it in a local currency. We'll use the dollar value of all final goods and services. And this is a keyword, so I'm going to underline that one. Produced in an economy in a given year. So this is another keyword, produced in a given year. So there's a few things that are not going to be included in GDP as a result of those keywords. Now, here's the spending approach. So we're going to kind of compare up here spending approach. It has four components. And it has consumption spending, which is really spending on new goods and services by consumers. So it's consumer spending on new goods and services by households. So let me maybe make this as nice and clear as we can here. So this would be haircuts, it would be new cars, but it's only for household consumption. Then we've got investment spending on three types of things. On new machinery, which would be considered kind of capital, new construction, so of any kind, okay, and changes in inventories of businesses. And one way to think about investment spending is that it represents the future of income. It's future income because if you're buying a new machine, it represents a claim on future income. You're going to be able to increase that. If you have new construction, then you can lease it out to someone. And if you have more inventories, then that means more things you could sell in the future. The next one is government spending on new goods and services. And it also, I'm going to say this even though it's never come up on an AP test, it actually also includes construction by the government. So in order to avoid like any confusion here, usually we just say any kind of new construction, even if it's for a residential household. But the exception of that would be that if the government, say, builds a new bridge, it would count here. And then this one is net exports, which are equal to exports minus imports. And so we subtract out the imports more because they count for someone else's GDP because they were produced in a different economy. So we would subtract out the imports, but we count the exports for us because they are produced in our economy. Now, the second approach is the income approach. Remember, we paused the flow up here and we said there's an income way to calculate, and it's going to yield the same amount. So income approach and spending approach always will yield the same amount because of the circular flow. So the first is wages. That's income paid to labor. The second is rent. That's income paid to land or machinery. And technically, it's paid to the owners of those machines. And so we could say, if you're renting an apartment, that would count as rent. The next is interest, which would be income paid for a loan or bond. And I'm going to keep that lowercase I because we want to make it distinct from the capital I with investment spending. And the last one here is profit, and that's income paid via dividends or profits from a company. So this idea is that if a company is earning profit, it's paying that out to somebody, some individual somewhere, and so they're paying that as part of their income. Common things that are not included, non-productive activities, right? So we said at the top that it have to be productive. It has to be produced. So there are lots of things that are not productive. So those would be financial assets if we trade them. Trade these don't count. So if we buy, sell stocks, bonds, and real estate, that will not count. So that's not productive activities. If we have non-market activities, that would be like home production, doesn't count. So I'm going to make this first one just a little bit clearer. Trading financial assets, stocks, bonds, real estate. And just to be clear, before I get too far into this, the financial assets themselves do not count into GDP, but the income that you get from them very well could, but it's not necessarily the buying and selling of them. Home production of any kind doesn't count unless it's being sold somewhere. Foreign activities, if they aren't exported, exports or imports. So in other words, if I am an American and I live in France and I produce baguettes in France, I don't count in the United States as GDP. I count in France's GDP. And then the last one here is goods used or produced, more technically, as part of another good that will be sold as a final good. In other words, the transmission or engine in a car, new car, to be clear, would not count, right? So we don't count every single step in the production process. Another example would be flour used in a donut factory. That wouldn't count because the donut would count, but not the flour that's used. So intermediate goods are also not counted. And then again, final goods and services produced in an economy in a given time period. So we also don't include one kind of last thing here. Used goods also are not counted. And that's because they're not really productive activities in a sense. Okay, now we're going to switch gears, talk about GDP, and try to make some adjustments to it. We have two ideas of GDP. One is real GDP and the other is nominal GDP. And real GDP is adjusted for price levels or inflation, whereas nominal GDP is the GDP given in a current year's prices. So the difference here is that we know that over time prices rise in an economy. That's called inflation. And so we have to make an adjustment for that in order to make comparisons over time. So we would use real GDP to make time comparisons, like how much GDP was there in 1955 and that kind of thing. And we have a tool to do that. It's called the GDP deflator. And the GDP deflator, I'm going to type this here. The equation is a little bit wonky to have it typed, but it's the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. And so this would be the real GDP is actually the GDP in a base year's prices. So GDP in a base year's prices. So later on, I'm going to go back and make this like a pretty looking formula for you. But for the video's sake, that's kind of what it is. It's nominal over real times 100. So we're going to use the table to answer 3 through 6 as kind of a practice to walk you through some of this. So nominal GDP in 2020 is just the output in 2020 times the price in 2020. So we have 8 guitars times $20 plus 5 drums times 10 is 160 plus 50 is $210, to be clear. Then the real GDP in 2020 using 2019 as the base year is output in 2020. So I'm going to actually type this up here so you can see where these numbers come from. In 2020 times prices in 2020. And then this is going to be the output in 2020 times the prices in 2019. So we have 8 guitars times 5, because we're going to use this price up here now, plus 5 drums times 6. So we have 40 plus 30 equals $70. So we can see that real GDP is much lower than nominal GDP because prices went up a lot. And if we look at the table, we can see the price of guitars quadrupled and the price of drums nearly doubled. So what's the value of the GDP deflator in 2020? Well, we have the nominal is 210 divided by the real is 70 times 100, and so that's 300. And that actually tells us, what does that tell us? It says that prices have overall increased by 200% because the change is 300, that's the new value, minus the old value, okay, divided by the old value. And so that's 200 over 100. So it kind of tells us that prices have gone up 200%, right? There's a 2 value here. And when we convert a decimal like this into percents, we just say that that's equal to 200%. So prices have gone up 200%. And that's kind of how we solve that. Now, question 6 says if nominal wages have gone up 400%, are people better off, worse off, or the same? And what we do here is we compare the nominal wage to the price change. And we'd say 400%, their wages went up by that much, that's bigger than 200%, so they are better off. If a GDP deflator, and this is not related to the table, 3 through 6, so number 7, if a GDP deflator is 80, what happened to the prices since the base year if the index is 100? And so the new minus the old divided by the old is how we figure out percent change. So that's equal to percent change. So let's solve that. The new value is 80 minus 100, and we're going to divide all of that by 100. So we end up with equal to negative 20 divided by 100. And that tells us that actually prices decreased by 20%. So that negative 0.2 is negative 20%. So prices have fallen by 20%. Number 8, what are problems associated with using GDP as a measure of standard of living? What does it not include that people value? What does it include that people don't value? We know that it includes pollution. We would say it includes, or at least we would say it includes the value of goods, but not subtracting, we'll say, pollution, crime, etc. It doesn't value things like leisure or happiness or life expectancy. It doesn't measure everything that we actually really care about. Expectancy, for some reason I can't spell today. So what we do, we usually make adjustments to nominal GDP to compare countries' levels of output. We obviously use real GDP, adjust for price levels, and we adjust for population. So we use per capita real GDP. So we adjust for population and we adjust for price levels. So hopefully this video helps you refresh a little bit of what you learned about GDP, and I'll see you next time.